Welcome back to Your Story with Ella, an advice podcast that focuses on real people, real life, and real stories. If you have a story to share, please do get in touch. You can send me a DM on Instagram by searching for Your Story with Ella, or email me at yourstoryWithElla@gmail.com. I would absolutely love to hear from you. The podcast is recorded remotely, so you can chat to me in the comfort of your own home. And most importantly, I promise I'm nice. Welcome back to a brand new episode. So I've decided I need to start making my introductions shorter. Not that anyone's actually commented, but I just know as someone who listens to podcasts myself, I, in the nicest way possible, do not really care what the host is saying, and this is something that my podcast has always been about. It's about the guest. It's the guest story. My life is not important, so I don't need to sit here and give like a 10-minute update all of the time, and especially now, because honestly it's just carnage at the moment in terms of moving. But I just was like, no, we're just gonna can't even speak as usual. We're going to keep it to short introductions, short and snappy, so the guests can have as much time as possible. So joining the pod today is Amber to talk all about her experiences with mental health and mental illness. I will insert a very quick trigger warning here, as we do talk about self-harming as well as suicide. So if you are triggered by those topics, then please do not listen any further. We also talk about seizures and dissociation. This is a 2-part episode, so a huge thank you to Amber for wanting to share her story and experiences to help others. You are absolutely amazing, and I just really hope you continue to get the best support and care possible. So without further ado, here is the wonderful Amber. Joining the pod today, I have Amber, who is here to talk all about living and navigating life with bipolar type 2, as well as the experience of mental health and breaking down the stigmas associated with it. Amber is also keen to educate people on the difference between mental illness and mental health, and I'm sure she has a ton of advice to share. So welcome, Amber. Thank you so much for wanting to come on and share your story. We haven't had anyone on the pod talk about bipolar yet, and I already have so many questions. First of all, I think I said this in my message to you, didn't even realise that like bipolar had like type 2, type 1. I'm like, wow, didn't even know that existed. And also I think it is so interesting you mentioning about the difference between mental health illnesses and mental health in general, kind of how you word it. And I said to you, I was like, I sometimes get really nervous, like there's so many different ways that we speak about it. So I think it's really interesting and obviously educational to know from someone that has that lived experience, like what is the right terminology that we should be using.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. So I feel like this is going to be a very educational episode. Amber kept saying to me, I've got so much to say. I was like, you can talk to me till 10 p.m. Or we'll just keep going. We'll just keep recording. Because I think there is so much to cover. And obviously
Yeah.
you have been through a lot. I don't want to go into it because that's what you're here for. You've got loads to cover. Some really interesting topics. So where do we start with all of this? Do you want to take us back? Where did it all begin? Where
Back
did it all begin?
I was born. I was just so I'm Amber. I'm 30 years old, which is scary to say. I turned 30 about 2 weeks ago, and yeah, it's a bit terrifying. Um, but I think I've struggled with mental health my whole life, but I was diagnosed with bipolar type 2 about 3 years ago. And yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about my journey and how I ended up getting to the diagnosis, and kind of significant points in my life that now I can look back in retrospect and realize that they were absolutely big signs and symptoms that I had bipolar, and I wish I had known it sooner. I would have got diagnosed about 10 years ago. So yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've always struggled with mental health pretty much as a kid. I was always seen as quite shy and socially anxious and just very quiet. I had a massive anxiety around food. And back in the 90s, when I was born, mental health wasn't really spoken about a whole ton. And I think, especially around children, I don't think it would have even popped into anyone's mind. So I was just
Yeah.
quite a shy and picky eater, but that wasn't really the case. I just had a lot of anxiety. I was very, very anxious growing up. I eventually overcame my food anxiety just on my own. And yeah, just like throughout my teenage years, I was just quite socially anxious. I also now know that a lot of this was due to being neurodivergent, which I'm at the minute going through the process of seeking a diagnosis for that. So that's a whole other kettle of fish. But it's interesting. I can now look back in retrospect at social aspects and realize that actually I had a few other things going on that weren't recognized. But my main struggles with bipolar started at around the age of 18. I went to university and I really struggled with my moods at university. Quite a lot of low mood. I just remember being depressed quite a lot. And that was when I actually first went to a GP and asked to be put on antidepressants. I took them for a few months. I didn't take them for very long. But I think being in quite a highly stressful environment was what was sort of making me quite stressed and depressed. I actually studied photography at university, which was really fun. I loved it. But I've always been a bit of a perfectionist, and I really, really wanted to graduate uni with a first. I don't know why, that was just my aim. No one put that pressure on me. It was literally just myself. I would obsessively shoot, I would do several photo shoots a week, and like no one else was doing that. I was like obsessed. Like I overshot. I was just in the zone constantly, and to the outside world it just looked like I was a super productive student, but this was actually a massive trait in bipolar. So it's called periods of hypomania, which is common in bipolar type 2. It's a less intense version of mania. You can just come across extremely focused or productive. You fixate on things. You sort of just obsess over ideas, and some people like even obsessively clean, like that's their thing. But because I was at uni, I was just obsessed with like uni work, making sure it was perfect, and just literally only concentrating on that. So yeah, I just came across as a very proactive student. But I would forget to look after myself. You basically lose track of all your surroundings because you're so fixated on whatever it is that your brain is fixating on. I lost a huge amount of weight because my brain was so busy concentrating on uni projects. I just lost all my appetite, and my mum thought I had an eating disorder. But it's like it's really hard to explain, but basically like your brain is so busy that you're like, what a waste of time to be like eating food, like I need to do this, like. So yeah, it's quite easy to like your weight to like lose weight when you're in those periods. But yeah, I also developed IBS when I was at uni, so that also didn't help with the weight loss. I was just very affected by stress, and I sort of created a lot of the stress myself. But yeah, just like those highly stressful environments just like definitely triggered something in me. But yeah, after uni, I still suffered with periods of depression, but they weren't very long. So I sort of didn't think I was depressed because I wasn't depressed all the time. But I also had periods of just not being me. So I'm quite social, but I'm like pretty average. Like I'm not like extreme in any of my behaviors, but sometimes I would have periods where I would like drink to excess, or I would just be very reckless. I would spend too much money. I was very impulsive. I'd go on nights out back to back on like work nights. I'd come in semi drunk. I felt like I needed pretty much no sleep or no food. But yeah, like I would just have these little periods of just like being a little bit all over the place, and then I'd go back to being me again, and then having these periods of depression. But when I was around 24, I moved to Manchester for work. So I used to live in London with my parents, and then I moved to Manchester to work
Yeah.
for a fashion company. Um, it was a pretty highly stressful environment. So with ecom, I was an ecom photographer. We'd have like a big target every day, and there was like models around and busy environment, and yeah, it was quite stressful. But I did enjoy it. It was good. It was a challenge, that's for sure. But yes, still quite stressful. But there was still a bit of an instability in my moods. Nothing major, like definitely only every like couple months maybe something would come up, or not like back to back episodes. But then COVID hit, and COVID impacted my mental health massively. I'm pretty sure it affected most people's mental health, to be honest. But everything that I had struggled with became a lot more noticeable. I just blamed it on COVID. It was a weird time for everybody. But most of my coping mechanisms were just out of the window. I couldn't see any of my friends. I couldn't keep busy with work. My structure, my routine was taken away. And I definitely had like more periods of being depressed a lot more frequently, and periods of being hypomanic as well, which obviously I didn't know at the time, but now I know. I would just be like every few weeks depressed, then feeling great, then depressed, then feeling great. It was just this constant cycle. Obviously, I only acknowledged the periods of depression and thought I was just, getting a lot more depressed and a lot more down. And it was just a lot more like concentrated, so it was a little bit more obvious that things were a bit iffy. So I just didn't feel right in myself. It was just such a weird time with lockdown, and it was just a massive shock to the system for me, as it was with everybody. Eventually I actually did go back to work, after a few, probably about like 3-4 months. Obviously being a photographer, it was essential that I was in work in person. I think initially they thought that no one would be buying clothes, or everyone's jobs would be affected, but actually everyone was buying clothes. So I was
Every
back,
day.
yeah, I was back shooting. We shot in a bit of a weird way. It was like we were with one like set stylist, and we didn't shoot with models for a while, and then eventually we did have models come back. There was a massive pressure actually with work to not contract COVID, because they would say, if one of you catches COVID, then the whole studio is going to have to like lock down. And it was really stressful, like, having that added pressure from those managers telling you, you have to follow like the rules really strictly because we must carry on working. But I felt really lucky to have a job still, because there were some people that didn't come back. And yeah, I just felt a lot more pressure being back, because I was lucky to have a job still and still be able to work. But yeah, it was just a little bit more intense and a little bit more stressful than it had been before. And it was already stressful and intense before. So Christmas 2020 rolls around, the Christmas that most people didn't get to go and have Christmas.
Yeah.
I had quite extreme low moods throughout December. I was very, very low, very depressed. I was very stressed at work. I wasn't having a very good time. But I actually did make it home to London in the nick of time. I think I left the day before they basically banned people from going home for Christmas. And I was so thankful, because my mental health was just not great and I needed to be at home. So I had 2 weeks off, but I literally did not want to go back to Manchester. I wanted to quit my job so bad. I couldn't quite explain how I felt to my parents. And I've done a lot of work on myself in how to explain my emotions. I think a lot of that's linked to my neurodivergence, but I used to bottle everything up and I didn't quite express how I actually felt. So they sort of knew that things were not great, but like not to the extent that they actually were. When I got back to Manchester, I just figured I was just really depressed. So I got in touch with my GP and I asked to get put on the same antidepressants that I was on when I was 18. The appointment was via telephone. Obviously, there was no face-to-face appointments, and I started taking that medication, and things went from bad to worse. I completely lost my appetite. I started having suicidal thoughts. I had panic attacks regularly. I was only getting about 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. And then I was still going to work, and I was literally so sleep deprived, but it wasn't affecting my energy levels. I was still quite energetic. But this went on for 3 or 4 weeks, and I was like, this medication is not working. Maybe I need to go on a higher dose. So I got back in touch with my GP and I said it wasn't working. Can I go on a higher dose? And obviously, this appointment was via the telephone. And if she had seen me in person, she would have seen that something was really not right with me. I was incredibly restless. I was constantly fidgeting. I looked so unwell from the lack of food and sleep. I was just really, really unwell. And well, when I went on the higher dose, things got even worse. I was super agitated, even more than before. I literally couldn't relax. I would do weird things at like 3 a.m. because I couldn't sleep, so I would just get up. I would get ready for the day. I would rearrange my room. I would pace around my room. I had so much energy flowing through me. I couldn't relax at all. I would go out for walks in the middle of the night. Like, it was really dangerous looking back at it, but I just had so much energy running through my body. I just needed to get it out somehow. Yeah, it was a really, really strange time. I was super depressed, but I was also really like erratic and impulsive, and yeah, despite the lack of sleep, I was just super energetic. Um, so I figured something was wrong, and I decided to take 2 weeks sick leave from my work, which was probably the best decision I made. I went back to London, and again, I felt really like guilty because obviously there was all these travel restrictions. But I thought, you know what? I just got to follow my gut. I need to go home. There was literally like no one on my train, so there was no chance of me catching COVID. Um, but yeah, I came home and my parents took one look at me and they were super duper concerned. Things got progressively worse. My energy levels were insane. The only way I could describe it is it felt like I had so much energy that I wanted to like rip my skin off. Like, I felt
Yeah.
so uncomfortable in my own body. I felt like energy running up and down my legs. Every time I would try and sleep, I'd have to just quickly like do bicycle cycles with my legs because I just
Yeah.
had to quickly move them because they felt so uncomfortable. I would just pace around my house like constantly. I wouldn't ever sit down. Um, I just had this constant need to move. My dad actually gave me a stress ball and I started rolling it around my face and biting it because I just like couldn't control the energy running through me. So we decided to look at the leaflet with the medication that I was given, and I had all 26 side effects.
Oh wow.
So yeah, we basically thought I'd been poisoned. I had just had a really bad reaction to some medication. I came
Mm.
off the medication cold turkey, despite the GP being like, please come off it, you know, slowly. And I was like, nope, I'm not keeping this medication in my system. It took a little while for me to get back to normal, but eventually, after a few weeks, I did feel a little bit more normal. And yeah, I actually ended up having another GP appointment. There was a Luckily, there was a mental health specific GP at my GP surgery, and I was referred to him. And he spoke to me and he said, actually, this kind of reaction is really common with people with mood disorders. And then that was when bipolar was sort of thrown around, and I'd never thought about it. And I now know that what I was experiencing because of the medication was a mixed episode. So you basically become depressive and manic at the same time. So it can be really dangerous. You could be so depressed, but have that impulsivity from mania that you commit suicide, basically. Like, luckily, it didn't get to that point, but like
Mm.
thankfully, like, you know, we caught it. And yeah, so, you know, it can be really dangerous. And apparently this kind of reaction is quite common with people with mood disorders. So yeah, it's something to bear in mind. Like, if you don't see a good reaction from antidepressants and things start to get progressively worse, it's something to definitely bear in mind. So I had a little Google about bipolar. I didn't know anything about it. And it was so weird. I Googled and all of the symptoms were me. It was like looking in a mirror. And it was so weird to me. Like, you would think, like, being hit with something like bipolar, you would just suddenly feel so depressed. But I was
Yeah.
like, wow, like, this answers so many of my struggles that I've had for the past 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, this is amazing. And yeah, it was definitely like a light bulb moment. So from there, I got referred to a psychiatrist. So this was still when I was in Manchester. I went back after my episode and things had calmed down. I went back up to Manchester, and that was when we started going through the bipolar diagnosis process. I was given an appointment, and because I had already connected with the dots with being potentially bipolar, I started listing periods of my life that I thought might relate to it, so I could go in sort of a little bit prepared. And he asked me lots of questions, went through all the symptoms, and I had stories to back up those symptoms. And that was when I got diagnosed with bipolar type 2. So he initially put me on a very, very low dose of a mood stabilizer. So I was on 25 milligrams of a medication called quetiapine. I still take quetiapine to this day. It's been very, very good for managing my bipolar moods. It's specific for managing moods, and that's why I always appreciate getting the diagnosis, because it's allowed me access to medication that can actually help me. But straight after the diagnosis, I decided that I actually wanted to leave my job and go home to London and just focus on myself for a bit. So I did that. But the transfer of care was very iffy. I was supposed to get referred to a psychiatrist. The idea was that the psychiatrist in Manchester was supposed to put me on 25 milligrams, and then this was going to be increased. So I went back to London. I got referred to mental health services in London, but I didn't see mental health services for 5 months. My first appointment, I actually didn't see a psychiatrist. I saw a nurse, and she wrote down, you know, the experience that I had in Manchester. As I said, I'm quite bad at communicating how I feel. Obviously, I'm a lot better at that now. So I probably didn't make things aware as well as I should have. Now I'm a lot better at advocating for myself, but I've had to learn that along the way. I initially thought that that bad period I had in Manchester would be the last time I ever had a bad period. I didn't understand the idea of bipolar and how it never goes away, and you're going to have bad periods and you're going to have good periods, and they're going to be there constantly. But I didn't know that at the time. And so in my mind, I didn't really need any help. I kind of was a bit confused with the bipolar diagnosis, but I also just wanted to have better medication, because in my eyes, if I took the right medication, then I'd be cured. But that's not how it works. And gradually my mental health got worse and worse. I was manic a lot. I had more mania than I did depressive episodes at that time. And then towards the winter of that year, I started getting depressed more. I ended up in crisis. I started self-harming. I was suicidal. So if you don't know what a crisis is, it's basically the worst you can get.
Yeah.
It's basically a big breakdown. Your brain just goes, nope, I've had enough. And you might act out in ways, you might attempt suicide. It's basically the worst you can get. I was given a crisis number, so I rang it, and I was terrified and I didn't know what to do. And I thought, well, this number might help me. I rang it, they gave me some advice. They said they'd be back in touch. No one ever got back in touch with me. So I was left alone again. So months went on, back to back episodes. I was very depressed a lot, very manic a lot. It was very intense. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. I had no one to talk to. My GP didn't know what to do with me. Eventually, they actually prescribed me with 75 milligrams of quetiapine, which is still incredibly low. Doesn't treat bipolar at that level, but it was something. Yeah, they were just getting a lot more severe and a lot more frequent, and I started to dissociate a lot as well. Dissociation is absolutely terrifying. It's basically your brain detaches almost from your body for a period of time. It's really weird. I can only talk about my experience with it, but I've had it to the very severe end of the spectrum where it's actually caused me to have seizures, which is mental because it's all linked to your mental health and there's all these physical side effects with it. So I think it's related to extreme anxiety. Um, I've not really received a big help with dissociation from mental health services because I don't actually, luckily, suffer from it anymore. But at the time, it was absolutely terrifying. They sort of look like vacant seizures, so I'd often just stare off and lose track of time and then come back. But what was really scary was that it started affecting me whilst I was skateboarding, and suddenly my brain would just switch off and I would end up on the floor. Yeah, that it was terrifying. I just felt really out of control of my body. And then I had a couple convulsive seizures. I actually got tested for epilepsy, but that came back as negative. So it was just basically pinned down to my mental health. But yeah, luckily I don't suffer from them anymore, thank God. But in the summer of 2022, I had my first major crisis. I was in quite a tumultuous relationship, and I think that wasn't helping. My parents decided to randomly, out of the blue, sell their house and move to the seaside. And they wanted me to go with them, and I was desperate to stay in London. My whole life was in London. Apart from that period, I'd been in Manchester. I spent my entire life in London. I'd spent a lot of time like making new friends and getting into new hobbies, and I just didn't want to leave. And it ended up in a massive crisis. I was self-harming, I was suicidal, and then I ended up having two massive back-to-back seizures. And I ended up in hospital, and then I got treated by the crisis team finally in London. And it's crazy, but quite often a lot of people have to get to the worst to get help. I was actually told that mental health services had failed me, and I was happy. They actually held their hands up. I mean, it didn't fix anything, but it was nice. They actually told me that they put me on the wrong pathway. So there's two mental health pathways. There's one that's for severe, complex mental illnesses, and there's for the less serious. I mean, it's still serious, but more generalized mental health conditions. So they put me on the wrong pathway, which meant that I just had the complete wrong people around me, lack of care. And they told me they were going to actually look after me and make sure that this didn't happen to me again and that I didn't end up in a loophole. I was a bit nervous because obviously I was supposed to be moving to the seaside. I realised I couldn't be in London. I had to go with my parents and I had to like be looked after by them. So they referred me to the mental health services in Hastings, which is where I live now. And I am so grateful to the Hastings mental health services. They have saved my life. It's completely different. I get so much more care here. So I'm under a service. I'm still under one at the minute, but you can go through periods of being under their care, getting discharged, but you can always go back to their care if you need. And I've currently been in the care of my mental health service for a year. So it's been really, really helpful, and they've given me lots of opportunities and things to do to help myself, which has been really, really great. I have a psychiatrist that I can talk to, who's the same psychiatrist. She deals with my medication. I'm on a lot higher medication. Medication's an interesting one. I've gone through periods of going up to the maximum dose possible, changing it and trying different medications. And I think initially I thought if I was on a high enough medication, then I wouldn't have to deal with episodes. But obviously, I've learned my episodes aren't going to disappear. It's how I manage them. Yes, the medication can help alleviate the side effects, but it won't eradicate the episodes. So I've gone from being on the highest dose possible to a couple months ago, I actually decided to reduce the medication because I actually felt like a bit of a zombie, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I felt like I'd lost my spark. And I've spent so much of my life not on medication and not knowing that I was bipolar that there is a part of me that thinks, well, was that I've lost a bit of me actually. So yeah, I'm now on a much lower dose, still a high enough dose to manage my episodes, but I feel a lot more me, which is good. So yeah, I've been through a definite journey when it comes to medication. But yeah, it's just realizing that it's actually a lifelong condition, and
Yeah.
that yeah, I don't get manic as much anymore. That's what I would say the medication has helped me with. And yeah, it's I still get depressed, and it comes in waves, but I definitely limit the way that I live, and I manage my surroundings and stuff to make I I don't go through those massive episodes anymore. Um so last year in April 2023, around my birthday actually, I had my last crisis. I went through a period of basically almost living and being in fear of whenever my next episode would be. Thankfully, I don't live like that anymore, but the last big crisis I had was in April 2023. Um, my mental health was declining for a few weeks. I was self harming. I had panic attacks. I was suicidal. And I actually did attempt suicide. And I ended up hospitalized on my birthday, which was really sad. It wasn't really a very good way to spend your birthday.
Yeah.
But one of the triggers was actually a friendship breakdown. I really struggle with friendships and relationships because my moods and my behavior can change a lot, and it takes a lot of understanding and care from those around me to know, well, Amber's acting a bit different. Maybe she's not feeling so good within herself. I find it quite uncomfortable when people come towards me and say, you know, you're acting a bit crazy or you're acting a bit weird, because then it makes me feel like I've got something wrong with me. Sometimes it's good, obviously, like if I was ever being really dangerous, then I'd appreciate people, you know, pointing things out. But quite often I just prefer people to just treat me like normal. It just makes me feel like a bit of an alien, to be honest. I was already in a bit of a decline, and it was my behaviour at that point that actually triggered the end in the friendship. So it's quite hard, like when you are going through quite serious episodes, it can derail your life, it can derail friendships, it can derail relationships. And I think that's the hardest bit about bipolar that I still really struggle with. Luckily, I surround myself with a little bit of a smaller friendship group these days, uh, but they're people who fully understand me, and they understand when I'm well and when I'm not, basically. So I think throughout this, I've realised that I've definitely become a lot more compassionate and a lot more understanding with people, because of my own experiences. Um, but yeah, that's just a general roundup of everything that I've been through. It's a bit crazy. I am in a
Absolutely
definitely
not.
I'm in definitely a better place, especially from like this time last year. Like I'm in a completely different space and I have a lot more support around me. And
Yeah.
like, thank God I've not had like a really, really bad episode in a year, which has been really great. But there was a
Mm.
period where I was having crisis after crisis every 5, 6 months, So it's been a really hard, long journey. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, thank you so much for that summary. And I think this is why it is so important that we do episodes like this, because maybe that person that you're no longer friends with can understand like what actually goes on inside your head and how difficult it is for you to navigate. Everything that does happen. So yeah, I just want to give you a massive hug for everything that you've had to face. And I absolutely love how you explain everything so well. Like it's so informative and it's just so important that we do talk about this to break down that stigma and for people to understand, yeah, what it is like. Because I think for even people like myself who are outsiders to bipolar, you just think it's like mood swings being quite up and
Yeah.
then being quite down when there is so much more to it. Like it's literally affecting your life quite drastically. And I think people need to be aware of that it's not just someone being moody one day and then they're really in good spirits the next day. There is so much to it. So yeah,
Yeah.
so much to cover. So thank you so much for doing that first of all. So I'm now going to take you back because I think it's really important as well. With your parents, do you feel like they knew how to best support you when you were younger, and even kind of where you're at now? Do you think they struggled with it? Like, yeah, what's their kind of whole perspective been on this as well? Because I think even for a family member it's difficult, isn't it? Obviously you're going through it, you're the person that's struggling the most, but I think it must be quite hard as a family to also know, like, what do we do? Like, how do we best support you? So, yeah, have you ever had like an open conversation with them on what it was like when you were younger to where you're at now?
Yeah, so I do obviously talk about how much I struggled with my anxiety and everything around that now in retrospect, and especially a lot more now because I do try and reflect on my mental health experiences a lot more because it just gives me a better understanding of like who I am as a person and what has shaped me.
Yeah,
But they really, really did struggle to understand me. I think they both lived a really busy life when I was growing up. So they might not have noticed how much I was struggling, but I also really struggled to communicate with them.
yeah,
So it was part me just bottling everything up and not communicating, and them just not noticing. But they've definitely changed. I think it was that massive crisis I had in 2022,
mm,
that was the one that sort of made them realize how difficult everything is and how much I
yeah,
actually am struggling, because initially like some of my smaller crises I had just kept to myself and I had like shut myself away in my room and just dealt with it alone.
mm,
But especially when I had started having seizures, it was a lot more visible, and my self harm was obvious to them as well, and they could actually see how much I was struggling. I think for a period they even thought like I could never live alone and
yeah,
I would have to be under their care all the time. But like thankfully I can say that right now I actually do live alone. I do depend on them an awful lot, and my
mm,
parents are registered carers for me. Um, but I've made a lot of progress. But the
yeah,
biggest change has actually been from my dad. I remember when I told him that I got diagnosed with bipolar, he said, "You're not effing crazy, and he really, really struggled with the idea that I actually had bipolar. And my
yeah,
mum actually was a little bit more understanding because she knew I had struggled with my mental health for a really long time, and she'd been the one who'd sort of got involved with my care. But what's really interesting now is that my dad is actually the one who's more involved in my care than my mum. He comes to
mm,
every single one of my appointments. At the minute, I've been receiving peer to peer counselling, which is really good actually. It's with someone who has gone through similar life situations, and we
yeah,
just chat once a week. And yeah, I've learnt so much, and so has he. So to go from someone who completely refused to believe I had bipolar to
Yeah.
now actively coming to every one of my sessions, it's made a difference.
Mhm.
My mum has had lots of struggles with her mental health, and we now know that she is actually bipolar as well.
Okay.
So she got diagnosed after I got diagnosed,
Mhm.
and it made me realise that I had lived in such a up and down environment that
Yeah.
I almost wouldn't have acknowledged or realised how unstable my environment was
Mhm.
until we realised, obviously. So yeah, it's interesting.
Mhm.
It's actually quite common for people with bipolar to have an immediate family member with bipolar, as it can actually be passed on through families. So
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. And it's interesting how your dad responded. I think it's definitely a generation thing as well. Like hear it with, older people now saying that why does everyone these days need labels on what they're struggling with? Why do we have to be labeled for everything? I think there is still so much stigma. I feel like our generation, we're a lot more accepting, but for an
yeah,
older generation, they don't like the idea of going to get a diagnosis and being on
mm,
medication. I don't know why. But I feel like there's a lot of stigma that still comes from those type of people. So people like our parents that just can't wrap their head around. And obviously, like, yeah, hearing words like crazy is it's
mm,
just such a generational thing as well. Like that is not helpful. But I'm so glad that your dad has now changed his perspective and it
yeah.
must have changed even more.